As a deer pants for flowing streams, so pants my soul for you, O God. There's something very human in that image that doesn't need much explanation. A deer in dry ground doesn't debate its condition. It doesn't philosophize about thirst. It just knows it needs water. It's built into it. The craving is instinctive, not optional. And David takes that very physical, very natural picture and applies it to something internal. He says that's what the soul is like towards God. Not casual interest, not occasional thought, but that kind of deep, driving need that you can't really negotiate with once it shows up. Now, most of us don't naturally think in those terms. We tend to think of spiritual life as something we manage, something we schedule, something we fit in when everything else is stable. But Psalm 42 doesn't really allow for that kind of distance. It's describing something more urgent, more elemental. There's also a quiet honesty in this verse that's easy to miss. David is not writing this from a place of emotional neutrality. The rest of the psalm shows he's in a kind of internal tension, maybe even discouragement. And yet, instead of pretending he's fine, he names the longing. He doesn't suppress it. He doesn't distract from it. He admits it. That matters more than it might seem at first glance, because a lot of people experience spiritual dryness and assume it means something has gone wrong with them. But this verse treats longing itself as evidence of life, not failure. You only thirst if you're still alive. You only long for water if something in you still recognizes what it was made for. It's a bit like being out on a long bike ride and realizing you've been going longer than you planned without stopping. At first, it's fine. You're just moving, taking in the road, steady pace. But then there's that shift where you become aware of something missing. You're not broken, you're just depleted. And suddenly everything starts pointing toward the need to stop and refuel. Not because you failed the ride, but because the ride was always going to require it. Psalm 42 verse 1 is like that awareness moment. It's not condemnation, it's recognition. It says there is something in you that is oriented towards God in the same way thirst is oriented towards water. Not as an abstract ideal, but as something necessary for life. And that brings up a question most people don't sit with long enough. What do you do with that kind of longing? Because there are really only a few options. You can ignore it, which usually means distracting yourself until it quiets down temporarily. You can try to replace it with something else, which sometimes works for a while but rarely satisfies fully. Or you can acknowledge it and let it point you somewhere real. David's approach here is the third one. He doesn't shame the longing. He doesn't pretend it's not there. He actually gives it language and direction. My soul thirsts for you. Not just relief, not just answers, not just better circumstances, but God Himself. That's a different category of need. And it's important to notice that because a lot of frustration in life comes from trying to satisfy that kind of thirst with things that were never meant to carry that weight. Success, distraction, approval, comfort, they can all be part of life, but they don't function like living water. And the strange thing is, the more you try to substitute, the more you usually notice the gap. It's like drinking something that looks refreshing but doesn't actually hydrate you. You can keep going back to it, but the thirst returns unchanged. This is where the verse becomes practical, not just poetic. It invites you to pay attention to your internal signals instead of ignoring them. When there's restlessness, when there's a kind of quiet dissatisfaction that doesn't fully go away, it's worth asking what it's pointing towards instead of just trying to silence it. Now, that doesn't mean every feeling of emptiness is a deep theological crisis. Life has rhythms. Some days are just tiring. Some seasons are just heavy. But Psalm 42 verse 1 suggests there are also a deeper layer underneath all of that, where the soul is oriented towards something beyond what temporary things can hold. So the application is not complicated, even if it is challenging. It starts with honesty. You acknowledge what you actually feel instead of what you think you're supposed to feel. If there's dryness, you admit it. If there's longing, you don't dismiss it. If there's distance, you don't pretend it isn't there. And then you let that honesty turn into direction instead of despair. The verse doesn't end in emptiness. It ends with orientation. For you, O God. That matters. The thirst has a target. And in daily life, that can look very simple. It can be a quiet moment of prayer that isn't polished or impressive, just real. It can be a return to Scripture without pressure to feel something immediately. It can be choosing not to fill every gap with noise, just to avoid the awareness of that deeper need. Even something as ordinary as a bike ride can become part of that rhythm, not as a spiritual performance, but just a space where your mind can slow down enough to notice what's actually going on inside. Sometimes clarity doesn't come from adding more input, but from reducing it enough to hear what's already there. And over time, what this verse forms in a person is not instant satisfaction, but direction. It teaches you to interpret thirst correctly, not as a problem to erase, but as a signal pointing somewhere real, somewhere steady, somewhere living. Thank you for joining me here today, my friends and family, and anyone else that might be listening on this here Monday. Thank you for joining us here today as we begin out this here work week, and I hope to see you here tomorrow. And until then, Abba willing, Shalom, Shalom.